Impact. I'm Brigadier General Shane Reeves, the Dean of the United States Military Academy at West Point. Through a series of discussions, we will show you a different side of West Point, where we will make even our most complex initiatives accessible to broad audiences and give you an inside view to our cross-disciplinary work, which is being applied throughout the world. Welcome back. Today, we have Lieutenant Colonel Will Cook, the Program Director for the Space Science Program in the Department of Physics and Nuclear Engineering, affectionately called the House of Pain. Get ready for a one-of-a-kind conversation on space and the modern warfighter. Welcome, Will.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here, and I appreciate you highlighting the space program.
We're going to have a good time today. So let me just tell our listeners a few highlights from your bio. So Lieutenant Colonel Will Cook is an Academy Professor and the Program Director for Space Science in the Department of Physics and Nuclear Engineering. He graduated from the United States Military Academy in 2004 with a Bachelor of Science degree in Physics. He was commissioned in the Aviation Branch and served as a platoon leader in the 3rd Squadron, 17th Air Cavalry Regiment during the surge in Baghdad, Iraq. He later served as a company commander in the 1st Squadron, 6th Air Cavalry Regiment during Operation Iraqi Freedom and New Dawn. Following his commands, Colonel Cook earned his master's degree in physics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 2013. He taught in the Department of Physics and Nuclear Engineering from 2013 to 2016. Following his junior faculty time, he spent 2 years working in NASA's astronaut office, working on the SpaceX Commercial Crew Program as the prime stakeholder for crew vehicle interface requirements on the SpaceX Crew Dragon spacecraft. Lieutenant Colonel Cook went on to earn his PhD in nuclear science and engineering from MIT before returning to USMA as an Academy Professor. Will is married to Vanessa. They have 2 incredible children. And my favorite part of the entire bio, 2 poorly behaved cats. All right, so let's jump right into it. So what is the biggest challenge now and into the future that we need to be thinking about related to space? And I will tell you, I'll tell everyone up front, West Point is deeply committed and aggressively pursuing the space domain when it comes to how it interfaces with modern warfare. And I think that you are right in the right place at the right time to talk on this topic, and I'm really excited about it. So what is the biggest challenge?
I think in the future, our soldiers are going to be operating with technology that has not even been invented yet. And that technology is going to interface directly with the space and all the assets we have in space. And from my background, looking back to the surge in Baghdad, flying a helicopter that was built in the 60s, that was upgraded with 80s technology, and then in 2007, we're flying with this helicopter. And even in 2007, we had capabilities that were very effective that pilots did not trust. And so we ended up operating without those capabilities because the operator did not trust the system. I think the same is going to be a risk to us in the future with the space endeavor. We've got the things happening in the magical world of space that enables our warfighter, but the warfighter has to understand the capability, that they have to understand the limitations, and then trust the piece of equipment.
So back to the 2007 example, why didn't the pilots trust the technology for those reasons you just stated?
One of the systems was called point track and offset acquire, and it was a fairly simple system. You had to know the limitations of it, and you had to really pick a high contrast on the view on the screen to get the system to track the point, and then you could fire a very precise laser hit spot to do a self-guided Hellfire engagement. And I think pilots didn't really fully understand exactly the limitations of that system, and the couple of times they would try it in training, it would do what's called break lock, and it would skew off very quickly. And very quickly, capability can become a vulnerability or a limitation in combat.
Yeah, it doesn't help if all of a sudden you don't trust it and you don't use it.
Right.
So that's a great example of one of the challenges that we are going to face. Today we have so much data. We say that data is ubiquitous, right? It's all over, our not just modern society, but the modern battlefield. And we have a bunch of new technology. And so the data and the technology, all this can be extremely overwhelming. And I agree with you, as we create and advance capabilities, as you just stated, that doesn't mean the warfighter will use it. In fact, I think there is a hesitancy to use these new technologies, especially if they don't trust those technologies. So have you thought about how we can better integrate capabilities onto the battlefield, in particular as it relates to the space domain?
I have. I think, first of all, we're going to have this steady stream of breaking technology that's coming out with an innovative army. That we're moving into this innovation era. And I think we've got to get that technology into the hands of soldiers very quickly. We got to let them play with it, let them break it, let them see the limitations and what vulnerabilities it has. And those are the soldiers. I think the officers need to understand the science behind it. They need to understand what's going on, what the limitations from a scientist perspective. And that very directly speaks to the assets that we have in space. And if you think about when they learn the science, they need to start to comprehend the capabilities, but then also the vulnerabilities, the limitations, and how they can leverage that in the fight.
You just made a great pitch for the academic program at West Point right there. Good job. Let me ask you this. Can you give me some examples of technology that you either see in development or you've seen deployed, say, since some of the last great technological evolution of weaponry in the armies, which is the 80s? And can you tell me some of those that you've seen in development that you think are going to be immensely impactful?
No, sir. Those are all highly classified.
Okay, good. Never mind then. That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say.
There is some technology that we can talk about that I think the listener can understand. And one of those is the global positioning system. Absolutely incredible technology that gives just kind of a superpower to the modern American soldier. But that has limitations. There's a 2020 Nature article, a scientific report, that talks about the decrease in the part of the brain that corresponds to spatial memory for those that use GPS, habitually use GPS. That's the part of the brain that corresponds with land navigation. And so we, as a society, are losing the ability to do our own land navigation because we're relying on GPS so much. So while we understand the technology, we're also going to have to continue to train without the technology and know where that technology is going to be limited.
I'm going to now skip the joke where about a lieutenant and their inability to ever use a map and ask you this. Can you provide me a few more examples where you think there might be an atrophying of human skills by over-reliance on technology?
I'll give you a couple of examples, one natural and one's human-made, and both that relate back to GPS. As you know, recently we had 5 coronal mass ejections coming straight to Earth.
What's another term for the coronal mass ejection?
A lot of people know those are the things that create northern lights, the aurora borealis. We have systems in space and systems on Earth now that can give us a pretty good idea of when that's going to impact Earth. We were able to tell the world, really the Northeast, to go outside and look for the northern lights, and it turned out you could see the northern lights all the way down to the Caribbean.
Yeah.
Right. But there's also that creates a limitation for some of our assets in space. Colonel Diana Laux and Dr. Jason Durr were running equipment and taking measurements when this happened. And the second night of this Northern Lights event, they measured 5 meters of error in the position. And so if you think about 5 meters on the second night, we think that could have been as much as 10 meters on the first night. And when you're talking about GPS-guided munitions,
sure,
5 to 10 meters is the difference between hitting a target and missing a target.
Yeah. Can you tell me about the man-made example?
In 2013, there was a truck driver, and bosses of truck drivers like to put GPS systems onto the vehicles so that they can track what the driver's doing throughout the day. Well, this one particular truck driver liked to take a nap next to Newark Airport. He didn't want his bosses to know that he was doing this. So he bought a simple little $100 illegal GPS jammer and turned it on, took a nap every day. And it was shutting down Newark airspace.
Wow.
And so with a fairly simple jammer, you can create significant impacts on the GPS signal. And we have to know that the enemy will do that in the next conflict. They will take every opportunity to jam the entire electromagnetic spectrum, not just the GPS signal. And so we have to be prepared for these vulnerabilities.
I mean, you could say that we shouldn't just be prepared because it will happen. It is happening if you look at what in Ukraine and how the electromagnetic field has become perhaps the most important part of that entire conflict, and how that war has evolved to the point that unmanned aerial systems are being affected, and there's this back and forth. And so how do you recommend that we prepare for this inevitability?
So I think, again, we go back to this notion of really the officers need to understand the science. I tell my cadets all the time, officers have to think outside the box because that's where wars are won. And if you don't understand where the box is defined, then you don't know how to think outside the box. And I do think you see a lot of that in the war in Ukraine. I think you see very intelligent, very creative people that are trying to think about what the next step is to create a vulnerability for the enemy and then leverage that system that they have to set this conditions for victory on the battlefield.
What are some examples of how space is influencing the Ukrainian fight? I'm thinking GPS, long-range artillery, low orbit satellites. Is that all about, right? Hypersonics even to some extent? Like, what do you think?
I do think it is an incredibly important aspect of ground warfare. Mm-hmm. I've always, as a pilot, I used to always say the main effort is boots on the ground.
You're triggering a thought in my head, which is as we think about Ukraine or even Gaza, any of these other conflicts that are proliferating around the globe, you're starting to see the criticality importance of space as it connects to land warfare. What do you think about that? Do you agree, disagree?
I do agree. Certainly the main effort will always be boots on the ground and the ground commander and what they need to leverage the conditions for success. But space offers a variety of assets to the ground commander, and I think you're seeing that play out in Ukraine in real time, whether it's imagery, connectivity, so connectivity through Starlink has been helping out, but also satellite communication, electromagnetic reconnaissance, global positioning system. All of those things are there to support the warfighter, and they all have their own unique sensitivities or their own vulnerabilities. And you see these warfighters in Ukraine that are having to think through in real time what these vulnerabilities are. I think we can understand that long before we ever go into conflict, what the technology is and then what the limitations are.
But that we should fully expect or be at least prepared for all of that tech to go down, is what you're getting at.
We should, absolutely. And the Space and Missile Defense Command is working right now to create scenarios in training for all the units where they start to lose certain space assets to make sure that units are still training with and without. When it's available, you should use it because it gives you a tactical advantage. When it's not available, you don't want to lose the conditions to still win the fight.
So let me shift a little bit here and let's talk about some of your efforts in the space science program. So what are those?
One of the big pushes I've been making lately is to increase the number of programming assignments. So we give a programming assignment, even though we're in the physics department. I want my cadets to understand how to write a fairly simple Python program and tackle a big data set.
How does that apply to space?
So everything in space is these monster data sets. You get raw data down from space, and you can rely on a third-party company to crunch the numbers for you, but we need officers that are able to crunch their own numbers and then pinpoint where the company has missed or their calculations went wrong. It's a system of checks and balances, and all of these are big data sets. So you can't just pull out a calculator and calculate something. You have to write a script and then tackle this big data set and think through how you creatively display that data to highlight when something has gone wrong.
Why do you think that's important for a new second lieutenant to be able to at least understand that?
I don't know if I necessarily believe a brand new second lieutenant needs to understand it. I think these officers are going to come out, they're going to get experience as a platoon leader. They might not see programming at all, but they're eventually going to grow into these senior levels, acquisition corps or senior levels of command. And when they get thrown the results of some big calculation done by either a third-party company or a staff officer, they need to know how to look at the data and ask the right questions to see if the calculations have been done properly, if what they are seeing is actually true, and really understand the bells and whistles behind whatever calculation that officer did.
And again, getting back to your previous point, which is that understanding is a level of redundancy for not over-reliance on technology.
Right. Yes, sir. Absolutely. And one thing I think is interesting is they can go tinker with Python after they leave. They don't
What's
need
Python?
Python is a programming language that's free. You can download open source programming interfaces and just continue to practice with Python in your free time. In most of the science missions in space provide their data free. And so they can continue downloading data from these science missions and then running a Python script and just to practice and just to remain curious and interested in the space endeavor.
As we start to see the increased competition and even the militarization of the space domain, is it likely that data will continue to be free?
I think it will. I believe NASA has a big role in all of these science missions, and NASA continues to press that the data that these science missions produce are open source. They're free to download. Sometimes you have to write the PI, the principal investigator, to get access to the data. But I think the future of science is this knowledge that it's not just the grad students that are in your program right now that have the answers. The answers could be out wandering around the streets looking for something to do. And it's sort of a crowdsource mentality of solving some of the bigger problems. So I think they'll continue to provide the data sets for free.
Well, can you give me some applications of the programming that you're doing with cadets?
One really cool assignment that I give them is we download all of the International Space Station, the recent position and velocity data, which is free to grab on the internet. And then I have them take that data and build a Python script that loops through all of these data points. And for each data point, they calculate the Keplerian orbital elements, which are the classic orbital elements for the orbit.
So explain that to me. What does that mean?
Classic orbital elements are an elegant solution to understanding what the orbit is. If you were to walk outside right now or this evening and see the ISS pass directly overhead, you would see it in view and then out of view in about 8 minutes, and you would have no idea when it would be overhead again. But if you calculate the classic orbital elements, you have more information, and there's 6 numbers. One talks about the shape of the orbit, so ellipse versus circle versus hyperbolic. One talks about the size of the orbit, and then they start describing the orbital plane. So the orbital plane will tilt, it will twist around the central axis of Earth, and then you have a rotation of the orbit inside that plane is the 5th number, and then the last number is the position of the satellite. Other than the position of the satellite, those numbers stay pretty constant throughout the orbit. And so you can make predictions that are days into the future where that satellite's going to be, and then you have an idea of when it's going to come overhead again.
I don't think NASA is going to lose the International Space Station. So how is this applicable to cadets more broadly?
If you think about when this space station passes overhead, and then you actually try to comprehend when the space station is going to pass overhead the next time, it's actually pretty daunting to consider that, because we're in a moving reference frame. We're spinning around the surface of Earth.
Doesn't feel like I'm moving.
It doesn't, but I've got some interesting data points on that later. If you think of friendly satellites, we want to know when they're going to be overhead so that they can support us, whether it's imagery, communications, or GPS. If they're threat satellites, we want to know when they're going to be overhead so we can hide from them. And having that understanding of the complexity of the space endeavor and the different reference frames really helps these cadets understand what's going on.
What are some of the other big changes that are happening in the space science program?
We went from a pilot to a fully approved 3rd science option for cadets. And so for the listeners, cadets right now, they take Physics 1 and they take Chemistry 1. And then they have the option to either take Physics 2, Chemistry 2, or Biology. We rebranded Physics 2 to give them another option, and it's a Physics 2 that takes place entirely on the canvas of the space endeavor. So we start with the orbital mechanics, and then we move into charges, electricity, and magnetism, all in the space environment, imagery, and they walk away with an understanding of all these things we've been talking about, with the limitations of how quickly an imagery satellite is going to pass over, or how far away your typical communication satellite is.
Give me some of the interesting research projects that are happening inside the program.
Absolutely. So going back to the ISS problem, Major Phil Schmedeman in the Operations Research Center has been working with the Space Force to, the Space Force goes out and purchases unclassified data from commercial companies of satellite observations. And they pay these companies to report the data, but then also to make a notification when there's a satellite maneuver. With the end state being that all satellites in the near-Earth environment are always watched at all times by unclassified data, and you can walk out and talk openly about what different satellites are doing. And so the goal is they're going into the second year for a systems capstone team, bring a couple of Payne majors in to help out, but to help these companies understand the data they have and try to get better at making very rapid maneuver predictions.
Give me another research project.
We also have, with DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and NASA and Oak Ridge, the Naval Academy is involved as well. We're helping design the first flown nuclear thermal propulsion rocket. And so the idea is to get it launched in 2026. And our cadets are making very real, very meaningful contributions to the understanding of what this rocket is going to do.
What is unique about this rocket? And I hear the word nuclear, so that makes me think about it.
Right. So if you think of a typical rocket, you have a chemical reaction that happens. So you have fuel and you have oxidizer or oxygen. And then in that chemical reaction, it creates heat in a combustion section that those chemicals expand out a nozzle, and that produces the thrust. In a nuclear thermal propulsion rocket, you don't have the oxidizer, you just have the fuel, and the fuel is heated by nuclear reactions. So the nuclear reactor core heats up very hot, hotter than a chemical rocket, and then you have nothing but hydrogen that is flowing out of the nozzle. And so you can get efficiencies that are more than double a typical chemical combustion rocket.
Give me a real-world application of how this could change things in terms of space.
The easiest thing to wrap your mind around is this notion of going to Mars. If we send people to Mars, it's going to take 9 months if we send them with a chemical engine. If we use a nuclear thermal propulsion engine, depending on the size of the payload, how big their capsule is, we can cut that down to 4 or 5 months or less if we're willing to send them with bare bones equipment and just get them there as quickly as possible. And that's all due to the efficiency at which you're using your fuel in a nuclear.
Theoretically, how fast could we get there?
I think you can drop all the way down into the 45-ish days.
Really?
And that is where you really have a bare bones capsule, the minimum amount of food. It might not be realistic because NASA has tended towards this mentality of having triple redundancy. And so triple redundant for food, for oxygen, for water. But inevitably, we have to get people to Mars as quickly as possible because of the radiation signature. And so I think the nuclear thermal propulsion system is going to be a part of the first mission to Mars.
First off, as you know, at West Point, we're very competitive. So if 40 days is the fastest, please figure out how to do it in 20.
We'll get on it, sir.
Sure, I'm sure some cadets can figure that out in Bartlett Hall. Hey, so why is DOD involved in this? Why isn't it just NASA?
The same system that can get us to Mars in 4 or 5 months, that could push a satellite around in the near-Earth environment for an incredibly long time. Sure. And so if you think of satellites are really just floating around in their orbit around Earth. And then every time you want to move that satellite, you have to use a little bit of fuel. And when you use that fuel, it decreases your total mission time. But if you're using that fuel more efficiently, then you'll have a much more extended mission. I like to say, if you're driving around in your family car and we each have the same car, but my car gets double the gas mileage, I could drive all day without stopping. We're both going to have to stop when our kids have to use the restroom every hour.
Sure.
But other than that,
you can adapt and overcome there.
We can overcome.
Figure it out. Yeah. So, we've had a number of astronauts that have come back to the Academy. They're very generous with their time and talk to cadets. And I often have a chance to talk to many of them. Shane Kimbrough, who's class of 89, Frank Rubio, Drew Morgan, both class of 98. And in the conversations with them, there's two big limiting factors to long range or deep space. It is the radiation and it's the effects on the human body. This seems like this could be a potential way to solve those issues also, if you can figure out a way to use the fuel in an efficient way to speed up the trip. Does that make sense?
It absolutely does. The trip to Mars, if you think about orbital mechanics, at Earth, we're going a lot faster than Mars is. We're going around 30 kilometers per second. Mars is out there doing something like 24 kilometers per second. So when we launch a mission, by the time you get to Mars, Earth isn't where it was when you started. It's nowhere near, in fact. And so at some point, you have to wait until Earth comes back into its position to launch a mission to return. So it's going to be a 2.5 year to 3 year mission. And the way to solve that is to get onto Mars and get underground very quickly. And then most of your mission is going to be underground. And then you can come out and do surface extravehicular activities when you know there's no big radiation storm coming from the sun.
And so how far along is the work on this type of rocket? Or this type of propulsion system, I guess, for the rocket?
It is a fascinating story in the history of this propulsion system. NASA built and tested the first rocket, tested on the surface of Earth in the 70s. It was called NERVA. They showed that it was functional technology, and I think everybody just agreed we weren't ready for this yet, and they disassembled everything and then put some manual on the shelf somewhere and said, we've solved this technology, we'll pull it out when we're ready.
And why were we not ready?
When you take a nuclear reactor, there's international policy that you can't go critical with a nuclear reactor if your orbital decay time is shorter than your fuel decay. And so you can't really use a rocket like this until you're beyond about middle Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit. And so the real use for a rocket like this is to go to Mars, and none of the other systems have been developed to get us to Mars yet. So we have the rocket to get there, but not all of the other life support systems.
It seems like private industry is moving out quite rapidly in this area. Potentially, are they, pick your private company that is operating in this space. Are they most likely to solve this problem, you think?
I do think the private industry is going to be the game-changing endeavor that helps us get to the moon and to Mars. Not necessarily that they will be the ones to do it first, but they are the ones that are generating the latest new technology. I think it was a fantastic program in the 2012 timeframe to transition all this technology from NASA into the commercial sector and then let them run with it. These commercial companies are more willing to take risks. They're more willing to have failures on the path to success. And I think they're going to take us a long ways.
So I'm looking at your uniform, so I see the Space Operations badge, but we have a Space Cadre course here at West Point. Can you talk a little bit about that?
The Space Cadre course is open to all majors and faculty members. So we generally have 2 or 3 faculty members that sit in the back.
It's good. I can boost my resume.
Yes,
awesome.
Sir. Even a lawyer like yourself could make it through the Space Cadre.
I absolutely could not. You know that. That's very nice of you to say.
We have 2 team members from the Space and Missile Defense Command that come in from Colorado Springs every summer. Good. And they teach 2 iterations of the Army Space Cadre Basic course to 40 total people each iteration, so 80 for the summer. And we have 30 West Point cadets. We invite 10 ROTC cadets, and then we usually keep a couple of seats in the back reserved for faculty. And they learn everything in the space endeavor, exactly what we've been talking about, the capabilities that the space endeavor provides us, but then also the limitations and the vulnerabilities, and what the enemy is doing to create new vulnerabilities for our space.
I mean, this is great. This is exactly something that we should be doing, because we're now deploying these young officers into the Army where commanders at all levels can access this knowledge. And it's such a great contribution to the academic program. Well, as you know, our academic theme this year is the human and the machine, leadership on the emerging battlefield. Underlying this entire theme is an emphasis on the importance of preparing cadets for future combat scenarios where technology and human leadership intersect. In your area, we can think about how science, in this case, space science, influences this intersection. And in fact, your background, your 2 years working at NASA, this is almost exactly what you were working on, this human-machine interface, if you want to call it that. So to this point, can you speak to the applications of space to the warfighter?
The space endeavor, it really breaks down into a couple of areas where space supports the warfighter. The one that most people readily know about, global positioning system, because you use it most times when you drive in your car. But also imagery. We have significant imagery assets that are there to support the warfighter. And we also have communications. And those all bring their own limitations. And so the interface, some of it is around knowing what the limitation is. And an easy one to think about is imagery. Our imagery satellites, if you want to get the highest detail possible, you want to be as close as possible to Earth. If you want to be close to Earth, that means you're going to be in low Earth orbit, right above the atmosphere, skimming along right above the atmosphere. That means your system's going to be in view for about 8 minutes. You're moving along around 8 kilometers per second. And once that system passes overhead, it's not going to be in view again for another day. And so for an operator using some interface to try to download imagery from a satellite, they need to be aware that there are very short windows when they can get high detail imagery. And then that specific satellite will be out of view for about another day. And they have to think through when do they need to time their request so that they can get this high resolution imagery. But again, all of the different endeavors have their own considerations, sure, like communications and GPS.
I have to go back to this question about the militarization of space. I once had it described to me that the space domain was perceived to be a global common, and that international treaties and relations recognized space was going to be used for peaceful means, which means that the technology that we've put into space, particular satellites, are almost like glass boxes. You know, there wasn't much of a thought about weaponization or the militarization of space or the weaponization of assets in space. We clearly have moved beyond that, and that clearly is a domain which has become a very competitive domain. Do you think that the assets that we have in space have the ability to survive in a let's say a total war that would include adversarial actions in space?
Our systems are robust. I think our DoD assets that we put in space are robust. I think we rely on a lot of non-DoD assets. We buy a lot of commercial imagery. We use a lot of commercial bandwidth for communications. Those are sensitive, and those we should expect to lose very quickly. But even our robust DoD assets, they are still vulnerable because they are out in the open, and anybody who gets close to it can mess with it, can jam it, or try to disrupt the electronics. And I think that's a big role of current research, is to understand that there's a huge theme right now across DoD research to study radiation damage and microelectronics. And as you think of the electronics, the size of a transistor continues to get smaller and smaller, to the point that a single hit of radiation can actually disrupt the electronics at this point. And so we do have a long ways to go to continue to make our equipment more robust. But I am confident that the DoD systems are as robust as we can get them right now. We will lose commercial capability. What
are your thoughts on the statement by Vladimir Putin that there's the technology available to the Russians to put into space a nuclear device that could severely, hamper or destroy thousands, if not more, assets in space? What do you think about that?
The science supports it. You can create artificial Van Allen radiation belts. And those radiation belts can persist for periods of time, and they can damage electronics. I do believe, our assets on orbit are robust to smaller levels of radiation. I think it would be pretty difficult to create an artificial radiation belt that's so severe that it takes out thousands of satellites. I do think commercial satellites are generally not anywhere near as robust. And those will be taken out very quickly in a scenario like that.
Do you take that threat seriously?
I do take that threat seriously. Again, going back to this notion of officers have to think outside the box. And I think that's the way we should be thinking. I don't think we would do something similar to that because you're going to hurt a lot of civilians and the assets. But we need to put our mind in that mindset so that we understand what the enemy is going to be trying to do.
Clearly, West Point is aggressively moving into preparing our cadets to be able to understand the space domain, understand its opportunities and its limitations. Where do you see West Point going in the next 10, 20 years as it relates to the space domain?
West Point is really an idea generator where we can create disruptive ideas that bubble out of the cadets and the faculty that teach here. And then as those ideas come out, they get formulated and then they can get partnered up with industry or national labs and create the whole new mindset for technology that we haven't even thought of yet. But to get there, we've got to teach robust introductory basic science. We have to help them think about very complex problems, and it's not until they see the full picture that they can start thinking about what technology is out there that hasn't been created yet.
And of course, our primary mission is helping prepare those cadets for this world. How do you see West Point helping the Army as this becomes a significant part of land warfare?
I'm very excited about the future in terms of being the intellectual capital for the Army. I think we're in the process right now of trying to get plugged into all the different units that are thinking through these problems. A lot of these infantry divisions already have innovation cells, and as we start to get connected to those and we start learning about the problems that are actively concerning the ground warfighter, we can start to bring those problems into West Point and produce solutions that they may not think of.
Yeah, and that's exactly why the United States Military Academy has created the West Point Works Innovation Hub, is to do exactly what you just said, which is connect and then really unleash the intellectual capital that resides here at West Point in an interdisciplinary way to solve some of the Army's big problems. And clearly space is a domain where we need to be thinking quickly about and how we can fight and win. So in your career path, you got your master's in physics, then you got a PhD in nuclear science and engineering. Why'd you pick those?
I was in my second tour in Iraq and applied to come here and teach and was accepted to MIT's physics department. And there were a couple of projects there that were absolutely fascinating to me. And so I went with the physics right out of combat. And that was an interesting transition because
sure.
Physicists are big brain people, and Army helicopters kind of simplify everything. So red button, green button, and all of a sudden I'm thrown into this environment that's a very basic science trying to answer problems that the way the universe behaves and come up with an elegant solution that describes it. Between my master's degree and my PhD, I transitioned from MIT's physics department to the nuclear engineering department, which is more of where you take the fundamental lessons learned in basic science and you try to apply it to the benefit of humanity. And I had the chance to walk that path with a radiation detector, quite literally pushing this 500-pound radiation detector across MIT from the physics department to the nuclear engineering department, and be a part of trying to transition what is a dark matter detector into something that Army operators could use.
How did your journey take you from radiation detecting into studying the cosmos?
So I was inbound as an academy professor, and the House of Pain needed somebody to run the space science program. The current program director was going to go on sabbatical. And between my background in physics and my 2 years at NASA, where I was working very directly on the Dragon spacecraft and making design feedback and kind of living the life of a space operations officer, it felt like I was a good fit, and the rest is history. It's been a very interesting and fun journey.
Tell me a little bit more about your time at NASA and as a space operations officer. And what is a space operations officer?
Sure. So there's a pretty wide role of what space operations officers can do. I was sitting here as a junior faculty member, and NASA ran a selection for a non-astronaut officer to come work and do engineer design work. And so I went down. It was a 2-year assignment. That required the Army to reflag me from a nuclear operations officer to a space operations officer. And then I spent those next 2 years working directly with the SpaceX team and the Dragon capsule, the human spaceflight team inside of SpaceX. Your more typical space operations officer, a lot of what they do is classified, but at a very high level, they are whispering into the division commander's ear what space capabilities we have, what assets we have, how we can leverage the conditions on the ground more effectively with assets in space.
Can you just give me a little bit more detail on those 2 years as you were working on that? You said it was the
Dragon spacecraft.
The Dragon spacecraft.
There were about 60 or 70 total requirements that NASA gave each commercial provider that relate to crew interface, so crew vehicle interface. And I was fortunate enough, they somehow trusted me to be a prime stakeholder for over 30 of those requirements. And they involved everything from the displays and controls and how you interact with the displays and controls, the suit interface with the vehicle, crew egress if it lands in the northern Atlantic and nobody's there to get them out. I actually had the chance to run a test in the Atlantic Ocean where we took a capsule out into the Atlantic Ocean and we threw astronauts in it and we said, okay, you need to hop out and climb into a survival raft. And it was an absolutely fascinating experience where NASA trusted me probably more than they should have, and I had the opportunity to work with some of the most incredible human beings on Earth, the U.S. astronauts, and this team at SpaceX.
I'll tell you that is probably the best part of my job is you're just casually throwing out your background, and it's really humbling. You're saying that you worked with some of the best people. I think that all the time. I'm like, this is such an amazing group of people at the academy with this eclectic disciplinary backgrounds, but just who have done phenomenal and amazing things. And I mean, you obviously fit right into that category. I mean, it's humbling to be part of it. But you are what is called an academy professor, right? And academy professors are officers specifically selected to come and serve at West Point after earning their PhD. And they typically spend the rest of their career at West Point. So what brought you back to West Point after you had taught here 3 years earlier in your career?
I was at NASA and I had just finished the interview round for astronaut selection. And they go from 18,000 down to 120. And I did not make the next round where they go down to 40 candidates. And so it very deliberately caused me to stop and think about my career and to really reflect on my career as an Army officer. And I had 7 years as an aviation officer. I had 5 years as a nuclear operations officer. I had several years at that point as a space operations officer. So I had a pretty wide sample from the Army, and I kept going back to my time at West Point teaching and standing in the classroom and working very close with cadets to choose a hard path, to choose the physics major, choose a nuclear engineer major, and seeing these cadets come into the physics classroom and help inspire them and get them ready to go out and lead troops in the Army.
Your story there about not making the final cut in NASA's almost mine exact, except mine is with the NFL. And I chose to serve my country instead of play professional football. That's not true.
I didn't know if I wanted to laugh.
I decided
That's
to make
great.
that up.
That's great, sir.
I often like to end the episode with some rapid fire questions. So you're going to have to humor me here. So the key is brevity, though. You only get a few seconds and a few words. So are you ready?
Actually, sir, I have some rapid fire questions for you.
All right. Well, first off, I'm going to tell you right now, I'm extremely confident I can answer these. You know why? Because I'm the dean. And as the dean, I basically am an expert in all of our academic disciplines. So this isn't intimidating at all.
Okay, sir. How fast does the International Space Station travel around Earth?
Easy. 30 feet a minute.
I don't know. You used the wrong units. That's actually.
Listen, the dean is infallible.
Sir, that's good. I'm impressed. 7.7 kilometers per second.
That's right. That's what I was thinking. That's exactly what I was thinking right there.
Okay, sir. So the space station is traveling around Earth. Earth is moving around the sun. How fast is Earth moving around?
I think you have incorrectly stated, because from my understanding, the Earth is the center of the solar system, and the sun revolves around it. I believe I understand that correctly from the Middle Ages.
There is a model where you can make Earth the center, and it's a very chaotic model.
So I just think your question's irrelevant.
That's correct, sir. 30 kilometers per second. That's a great answer.
Yeah, that's where I was going with that.
As the Earth travels around the sun is traveling around the center of the Milky Way. And so space station is traveling around 8 kilometers per second. Earth 30 kilometers per second around the sun. How fast do you think the sun and the solar system is moving through the universe?
I'm just going to throw out something. 230 kilometers a second.
That is impressive. So that is spot on.
I just had to think about it for a minute.
It was good.
I had to do some calculations. Right?
I think you might be able to get there with just the numbers that you knew. That's good.
Yeah.
I'm impressed.
Yeah.
Well done, sir.
No problem.
And so the Milky Way is also traveling through space. How fast is the Milky Way traveling?
So is space expanding or shrink? I don't remember.
It is a constant debate and currently expanding. Although I'll have to check with my astrophysics PhD to get the latest.
I'm going to go with my 40 time, a 4.5. I ran a 4.540. That's what my answer is.
That's a good 40, sir.
It's pretty. It's not even close to accurate, but that's what I think it is in my head.
Right before the NFL offer.
Right.
600 kilometers per second.
Yes, that's it.
So I don't advise you look at the sun, but if you were to look at the sun, how old are those photons that strike your eye?
The photons. Gosh, I mean, I would, I'm going to say those photons are 1 million years old.
They are. So it takes 8 minutes to get from the surface of the sun to our eyes, but then those photons are created in fusion at the center of the sun around 1 million years ago.
That was my Dr. Evil. $1 million.
1 million, and it was a perfect answer.
Thank you.
It was very good.
Thank you. Now it's my turn.
Yes, sir.
That was exhausting. I was sweating. I wasn't ready for that. Okay. Who's the most inspiring leader?
So I have a laundry list of people, but Colonel Ken Chase, my squadron commander when I was a troop commander in combat, absolutely influential leader. Fantastic awesome. Human being.
If you have dinner with one historic person, who is it?
I'm going to say Buzz Aldrin. And Buzz, you can call me and come on up and talk to West Point.
Love to have Buzz Aldrin. What would you ask him, by the way?
I really want to, they all have their, I think, scripted response about what was going through their mind on short final to the moon landing. I want to ask them in person.
Sure.
I want to pry. I want to see really what was going through your mind.
I bet you it would be something technical, is my guess.
I bet the first words out of his mouth would be the checklist.
Yeah, the checklist. All right. So what's your favorite song?
I have different songs for different moods, and so I'm going to give you my programming song,
okay.
Madness by Muse.
Madness by Muse. What's your workout song?
I don't know if I have a recent workout song.
See, that's because you're in pain. You guys don't work out. I can tell.
Programming is my workout.
I like it, yeah. Biggest leadership challenge you've ever faced?
When I was in my second company command, I had command with a staff and no soldiers and no equipment.
Oh, that's tough.
It was a fascinating and very challenging experience.
Hardest class you've ever taken?
Elementary particle physics, and I'm going to give a warning to the listener. If you ever sign up for a class that has the word elementary in it, it is going to be the hardest class you ever take.
Do you have any parting advice or takeaways for those listening?
So I think we're at this point in society where more and more decisions are going to be made by artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
And I think artificial intelligence is, a lot of people think it's this black box that you put something in and a prediction comes out and you don't need to know what's happening in the inside. But anybody can go download a programming interface. You can take a couple of classes on Python and learn how to read Python and then run through tutorials for machine learning. And you can actually do some toy model experiments with machine learning and really start to understand what these large language models are doing, what image classification or the autopilot driving, voice to text and text to voice. You can understand all of that with a couple of classes on the weekends and just self-driven tutorials.
That's great advice. So thanks, Will. This was great. I know our audience is going to enjoy it, and I have enjoyed it immensely, so thank you. Be sure to tune in to the Inside West Point Ideas That Impact podcast next month. Remember, you can find this podcast as well as the other podcasts, journals, and books hosted